Good morning. How are you doing? All right. Yay! Yay! So first, a short disclaimer. It was displayed as like, global state of the PC market. It's just going to be Steam data. It's a little bit more humble in terms of what I'm going to present today. So my name is Thomas Bidaux. I'm French. I live in the UK. I run a company called ICO Partners. We do lots of different things. Before that, I was very much into the MMO business on the publishing side. And now ICO Partners is a consulting agency and a PR agency as well. We do lots of things, and among a number of things, we look at numbers, we look at market data, and we try to understand what's going on. And mostly we look at the PC side of things as a main focus. Usually people know me as well because I'm really passionate about crowdfunding, but I'm not going to talk about that today, for once. I'm also very obsessed with data around PR and how people talk about video games. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about Steam. And one thing we do is we have a weekly newsletter that goes into people's inbox that says, here are the games that were released last week on Steam. That tool was initially built for me because as more and more games were released on Steam, it was difficult for me to get a good grasp of how many games were coming out and which were the most relevant and which were the most followed by players. There's also an interesting pattern where you can have like big hit on Steam that everybody knows about, but you can have big hit on Steam that nobody knows about because they come from like sub-communities, they have like specific interest groups that follow them, and so it was a good way for me to kind of like make those games kind of like stand out and understand what was going on. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about here is kind of a consequence of that Steam newsletter and the data we pull from that, because we use the Steam API. We do go into Steam data a lot for that. And before we go there, I want to mention the way it works. So everybody can get access to the Steam API. It's relatively easy. Just need to have an API key. The thing with Steam data and the Steam API is that anyone who kind of like go into it will probably know it's a little bit messy. It's a bit complicated sometimes to get some proper data. So whatever data you get from the Steam API, you need to parse, you need to treat in some ways, you need to clean, you need to adjust. I'll give an example which is probably the most striking example of where the Steam data is confusing. It's release dates. So, and because I'm going to talk mostly about data over time, it's a very important thing. The Steam release dates in the API comes from whatever the studio put as a release date for their game. So imagine they launch a game on Steam that's an old game that's published like in the 90s. They'll say, well, the release date was, February 92. So that's what they put as a release date. And so if you go into the Steam API and you look at the date, then it looks like it's a game that's been released on Steam like before Steam even existed. So you need to do a bit of magic, a bit of adjustments. It's not that difficult, but it requires some time. You can't just use the Steam API like that. But the Steam API is a fantastic tool. There's lots of things that we can do with it. And I think we're only scratching the surface of what you can do with the Steam API. Anyway, other sources of data I recommend would be Steam Spy, which lots of people use and know. The Steam Charts and SteamDB, they're all very, very good source of data. Because the way we do work with the data, we don't have like a website where we release our own data. We just go into the API, do the newsletter, store the data for our own use on other things, and that's it. So all these websites are really, really good use. And there's the last thing I would recommend if you are interested in benchmarking for games or looking at data on Steam, is to use the Enhanced Steam browser plugin, the extension for browsers. It basically plugs into all those websites and put them into the Steam page. So you just go into your browser, check a game, and in one page you would have a lot of the different information that you want for a game. this said, let's go into the data. So the first thing to look at is like, how many games are released on Steam. And I don't think it will be any surprise for anyone. There are more and more games that are released on Steam. At the moment, there's like 16,000 games on Steam. There's like 2,700 games that were released through early access. And you have like 1,700 games that are still in early access. And over time, it looks like this. And so, yeah, it's getting more and more games on Steam. There's these are weekly data. We're getting close to 200 games a week released on Steam. Like last week was 220. There was a week in including the game releasing out of early access, which don't show here. So there is a huge volume of games now on Steam, and it's probably accelerating, and it's probably going to keep accelerating for some time now. The interesting ratio as well is that that acceleration is mostly on games that just released directly on Steam. Even if there's a growth on early access games and the way they grow over time and how many more games are available on the platform, this is mostly just games that just go directly to Steam. And so we see more and more mobile games that are released directly through Steam. The game exists, they just make a PC version and launch it out. So this is the profile for that. There's interesting metrics to look at. If you look at Steam Spy and number of owners of games that they estimate is really valuable, very interesting. On my side, because I don't have the resources they have, I look at a very simple metric, which is the number of user reviews a single game has. And user reviews is a very interesting indicator, even if it's not always representative of sales. I mean, there's a moment where the number of sales kind of like multiply over the number of reviews in a significant way. There's also certain games that encourage reviews to be reviewed more than others. Like, some games have a very strong emotional component where people are really into it. Some games are really shitty and people want to really review them and say they are bad. So the number of reviews is an interesting indicator of was that game noticed? Was that game as a significant user base enough for that? And so I use user reviews like on the weekly newsletter just to check, which games how many games are actually kind of like on people's radar. And there's only 3% of all the games on Steam that have 0 reviews, which is maybe a lot, maybe not so much. But for me, it's actually quite significant that it's only 3%. However, if you look at games that have less than 10 reviews, which is also kind of like in the range of the low numbers, looking overall data on Steam, and it's like a game out of 4 doesn't have less than 10 reviews on Steam. And 10 reviews is the number of reviews you need to have the average review score showing up on the Steam page. Below that, it doesn't appear. So it's a significant threshold. And half the game that were released in 2017 don't have 10 reviews. They have less than 10 reviews. And so that's a really large number of games actually don't show up on that. Early access. So, like I said, like 2,700 game released in early access, 1,700 still in early access. About 17% of all the games on Steam went through early access, so it's actually quite a popular scheme on Steam, even if it's minority. It has a significant portion of the game that went through that process. 37% of all the games that went through early access have released, which you have to consider it's actually a high number because the average length for an early access is about 200 days. So any game that was released in early access for the past 200 days are still in the average period before they release. And there were more games released in the past 200 days than the 200 days before because of that acceleration on number of releases on Steam. So that kind of like, 37% is relatively decent in that sense. And that's the current acceleration. Game releasing into early access are in orange. The game entering early access are in blue. So same kind of acceleration, but the number of releases kind of stays stable. It's probably going to be like 6 months delay between the two curves, and we will see in 6 months, do games that release now in early access tend to release in the same pace as before or not? The other interesting thing is that curve of the ratio of early access games that get released. And it took a while for early access to kind of get its pacing and get into some place. And you can see there's the point here where the curve accelerates. Is also the point where the ratio of games kind of like or releasing early access kind of like still increases until it's stabilized into that 37, 38% of the games getting released. So we actually have a pretty steady pace, and because it's over time, I don't think it can get higher because there's going to be way more games released into early access. The portion of them that may never release might increase, maybe, but it's so we might have reached the peak ratio. It will never go more than 77%. But it's actually not as bad as a lot of people say in terms of early access games being stuck into early access and never getting out. Just for the anecdote, the game that stayed longest in early access stayed 1,400 days into early access and released just past this August after being in early access for like 4.5 years. So they do get released eventually. Next is Steam Direct, which is the latest evolution of Steam as a platform. We went from a gating system where either you know someone at Valve and you get an app ID and you can release on Steam, or you go through Greenlight, get enough vote, get an app ID and they can release on Steam. Now it's all like the App Store. Just put some money on the table, $100, check a couple of boxes, and then you can release on Steam. And Steam Direct is having a profound effect on the releases on Steam. So that's the number of releases every month in 2016. And we're beginning, getting closer to the 500 games a month throughout 2016. This is number of releases on Steam per month in 2017, and we keep the kind of like momentum from 2016, getting more and more games every month. March, passing that 500 mark again. But now July, August, 2 months in a row where you have more than 600 games released, and then more than 700 game released, closing to 800. And if you look back, if the pattern stays the same, July, August are not slow months, but they are not the biggest. It peaks at December for some reasons. So if we keep that pattern, it will be quite interesting to see where it gets. So that's the 2 years side by side. That's the kind of like, this is the picture of what is Steam in 2017 compared to last year. And it's no comments. It's very telling. The other thing that is interesting is to see where it happened here. And so Steam Direct was launched the same week as E3, a week before the Steam Summer Sales in June 2017. So it's here. And that's basically launching your game during E3 is just, nobody does that. People are also too busy. Launching your game during the Steam Summer Sales, is also suicide, because all the visibility goes through the games that are on sale. Despite that, the kind of like uptake that we see in the number of games released on Steam after Steam Direct launched is very, very, very significant. So we had about 70 games a week before. We're going to 77 a week before Steam Direct, and right now we are 114. And that's only because there's only a very short sample of data since Steam Direct. It's only been 3 months, and we are in the summer. We are going into the high peak of releases of games in the coming 3 months again. So by the end of the year, that number will be very different. How am I on time? Oh, I was quicker than I thought. There is other interesting, so this is not supposed to be alarming. This is just the reality. This is what people need to be aware of, how Steam is in terms of the volume of games, the number of games that get released every year, every month, every week. But there's other things to take into account. We're looking at maybe 800 games a month going to be released on Steam. On the App Store, on the iOS platform, it's 2,400 games a month. So it's kind of like, we're still looking at a third of as many releases as in mobile. But we're getting close. We are getting in the same order of magnitude as on the App Store. The other thing that's interesting is last week, the Sergey Galankin from Steam Spy released some data. He looked at the same period of time over 3 years in terms of indie games that get released on Steam. So he looked, I think, over a period of 1 month in the summer, and he compared 2017, 2016, and 2015, and how many games were released, and how many new owners in total those games were getting. And he was just looking at games with the label indie, not looking at the AAA titles. And there's many more games that it released. However, there were more games released in 2017 that got more than 100,000 owners. It went from 3 in 2015 to 7 in 2017. So there's also more indie hits in that bigger volume of releases. And also the percentage of money made by the top 10% of the game released is kind of about the same over the years. Except top 10%, you go from like 20 game to 40, 50 game. So there's more games making that high level of revenue now than 3 years ago. There's also more games making no money. So there's a serious consideration there. You want to be in the top 10. There's more slots in the top 10, but there's more people competing for that top 10. But this said, there's serious consideration there for how to position your game and make sure that you get in top spots. There's another thing I think that's interesting to consider, which is a lot of people go into Steam with the idea that the audience is there and they're going to take a share of that audience and make money out of it. I think it's probably a good time to consider Steam in a different way. Maybe look at games that could grow the Steam audience and bring new people to Steam and have them not compete with everybody else, but just on your own staple of games. The pace of which the number of releases on Steam has increased doesn't match the number of people going into Steam and the growth of the platform. So maybe there's some interesting ideas to go there if Steam is the platform of choice you want to go in. And we'll leave just like maybe if people have short questions or anything like that. Yes?
Yeah, I have a question about the future of PCs. Do you think that our Steam is going to keep going in a big monopoly and grow, or do you think that there will be some kind of change?
Yeah. I'll repeat the question so that the recording has it. So is Steam going to keep its monopolistic position? I think they are really good, strong challengers in the making right now to take some market shares off Steam. I think taking it, a huge chunk of it is difficult, but I think Twitch and Amazon are definitely making a very strong play and a very good opportunity to take a good market share out of Steam. The fact that they have access to the influencers and they facilitate the marketing makes them probably, for me, they are the second kind of like, in terms of potential, they can become like the second PC platform and be a significant player in the space. There's other things that are happening. You can see a lot of other digital platforms trying to position themselves. I think they don't have as strong as a position as Amazon, but over time, the more monopolistic you become, the more opportunities you create for people to kind of like differentiate themselves and take some shares. So I do believe Steam is not going to stay that monopolistic one solution for PC over time. One last questions? Hope it was interesting. Thank you. Enjoy the day.